I'm a bit of a history buff and always like visiting houses and churches and battlefields. Now last summer found my wife and I and two other couples on a walking holiday in Scotland. Now by way of a walking holiday I meant that we were in cars which we drove everywhere and then got out to walk to places of interest, and we were staying in hotels. The long lauded delights of camping outside in the fresh air had long been overtaken by a desire to be warm and comfortable. We'd ended up in the pleasant town of Pitlochry in the middle of the Scottish Highlands. We were there for 4 nights and this was our last night. We'd had pleasant times walking along the banks of some of the lochs, walking up in the hills, walking along rivers, and indulging in my wife's retail therapy, of which I'd had more than enough. And this was our last night. The hotel was lovely. It had very comfortable rooms and a very good bar and an even better restaurant. I'd read about the Battle of Killiecrankie and had expressed a desire to go and see it, but my friends were too keen on our last night to enjoy the comforts of the hotel, so I decided to go by myself. I asked the hotel to make me up some sandwiches and a flask of coffee, and I slipped half a bottle of whiskey in my pocket just to be on the safe side. And I set off. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the mocking laughter of my wife and our friends as they sat in the bar enjoying themselves. But it was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was warm, the air was warm, and I set off towards the battlefield. It was only 3 miles away. It was an easy walk. There was an A road I could have taken, which evidently went right through the middle of the battlefield, and the Jacobites lined up on one side of the road and the British on the other. But there was also a B road, but also, more importantly, there was an old track that ran up the side of the river, and it was up this track that the British Army went to the battle. In fact, they weren't going expecting a battle. They were going to besiege a Jacobite castle in the next valley. It was a lovely walk. I was by myself. I didn't meet anybody. The path itself was earth and stones, and it was only wide enough for 2 people. I imagined the English army marching slowly up this road, walking 2 abreast. There wasn't room for any more. On one side was the roar of a river flowing down a deep ravine. On the other, behind the trees and rather muted, was the sound of the roads. I imagined this army walking up this path. There was evidently around 4,500 men. There was also cavalry, a baggage train and several cannon. And I imagined the red-coated soldiers in their tall red hats with the gold badge on the front marching up the road, with the white leather equipment harnesses strapped across their shoulders, and the tall rifles with a bayonet slung over their shoulders. I imagine the sound of their feet. I imagine the sound of their swords and the rifle rattling on their shoulders and at their waist. I imagined the clop of the horses and the rumbling of the iron-bound baggage carts going slowly up this track. I imagined the drummer boys, no older than about 10 years, beating a slow, steady sound on their drums, keeping the marching going. I reflected on the cause of the war. It was 1896, and it was as a result of the glorious revolution. James II of Scotland and England had been overthrown by the Protestant William and Mary from the Netherlands, and the Scottish clans didn't like this, and there was a Jacobite rebellion as a result, supporting James II. And this was one of the battles. The Scots won the battle, but the following year they lost the rebellion entirely. As I walked along, I was enjoying the conjurings of my imagination, and within an hour I'd reached the site of the battle. This was where the Jacobite army met the English. I crossed over the two main roads and found a path onto the battlefield, and found somewhere comfortable to sit, somewhere close to the middle of the battlefield. The sun was beginning to set. It was a glorious sight, setting the hilltops lining the pass ablaze with the evening light. It was beginning to make shadows deeper in the valley. I looked around. I imagined the Jacobite army lining up above me on a ridge on the hill. They would have been watching as the royalist army marched up out of the valley and spread itself in a long line on the lower slopes of the hill. The royalist army redcoats shining in the evening sun, whereas the rebels, dressed in their plaid and tartan, were more difficult to spot, blending in with the grasses. As the sun got lower, I recall the battle didn't start till around 7 p.m. because the sun was shining in the rebels' eyes. I watched the sun slowly go down and the shadows rise out of the valley till they reached the mountain tops. The sky was a deep blue. The hillsides changed from a green to a deep violet. The whole valley was silent. There was no traffic. I surveyed the battlefield, imagining the royalist musketeers shooting up the hill at the Scots. And then at around 7 o'clock I imagined the Scots charging down the hill, swords and shields waving and yelling their war cries. The royalists, although they had a superior force with cavalry and cannon, had no time to prepare for the charge, and they were routed. The killing was at its height, the royalist soldiers retreating in a rout back down towards the river and back along the track that we'd come up. It was a very satisfactory evening, made doubly special by the fact that this was the anniversary of the battle. The air was still and warm and the sky was beautiful. The sun slowly sank between the two hills. It was captivating. I retrieved my sandwiches and my thermos from my rucksack, and as I dined, and this was dining in the fresh air with this view, the meal could not have been bettered by a Michelin star restaurant. The air was still warm. A slight balmy breeze rustled along the grasses and the leaves in the trees. I heard the tiny scuttle of tiny feet in the grasses. The sky was almost black overhead, and a myriad of stars were beginning to appear. I resolved to stay out all night and texted my wife as such. All I got in return was a smiley Joy. I found a comfortable place to lie down and I settled, with no intention of going to sleep. There was too much to experience. I heard the sound of owls and occasionally saw one flitting over the ground in search of their dinner. I saw the occasional deer leap across the field, and a pair of foxes hunted in the hedges. And then I saw the edge of a full moon beginning to crest the shoulder of the hill. The tops of the hills took on a white, translucent colour. I watched the edge of the moonlight slowly travel down the sides of the mountains, the moon slowly filling the valley with a pale white light. The light became so bright it made the shadows cast by the trees and the hedges and the walls and rocks pitch black. Everything else turned bright white. I gazed at this eerie landscape, marvelling at its beauty, thinking this is something my wife and friends will surely be jealous of. I heard a bang and then another. Was it poachers? And then in the distance I saw a line of flashes and white smoke rising. The firing intensified and the white smoke started billowing out. I thought I could smell the acrid stench of black powder. The noise was tremendous. Through the smoke I could see lines of old soldiers in long coats and tricorn hats firing long muskets. There was no colour to them in the light of the moon, they just looked white, casting black shadows on the ground. And then, to my right, above me, in the hill, I heard an infernal scream, and then men shouting and screaming and running, ragged lines of men running down the hill with long swords and round shields held in front. Some fell as they ran, not to move again. There was no colour for the moment, and the running men crashed into the lines of the firing soldiers. There were screams and shouts. The black powder smoke was blowing away. I could see vicious fighting. As the smoke cleared, I could see more detail and colour. There was colour then, bright crimson red, splashing on the men, splashing from the men, even staining the white ground. No one took any notice of me. Highland men ran past very close, not seeing me at all. The Highlanders were pushing the Royalists back down the hill into the valley, and I was left alone. I knew this wasn't right. This was more than some crazy reenactment. But what? I found myself shivering with cold, even though I could still feel the warm breeze on my cheek. I stood stock still. I came to see the battlefield, but not the actual battle. What was happening? I looked around. The battlefield was covered in bodies. Everything was white from the moonlight, except for the black shadows and the grotesque splashes of red over the bodies on the ground. Hundreds and hundreds as far as the eye could see. I could hear moaning and crying and babbling. I could hear prayers being said. I had no idea what to do. I sat down on a tree trunk and looked, trying to understand what I was experiencing. Eventually it went quiet. I could hear no wind, no owls, no scurrying little feet, nothing. After I knew not how long at all, I heard a voice. Not a war cry, not the sound of a dying man. A beautiful, haunting lament, seemingly in Gaelic. A woman's voice, the purest singing voice I had ever heard. It came from a stand of trees to my left. Deep black shadows amongst the trunks and branches that were bleached white in the moon. The lament went on. I was entranced. Such beauty after what I had seen was such a startling difference. There were at least 10 slow, melodious verses before the beautiful voice faded slowly away. I yearned to hear more and more of that wonderful voice. Then I heard a rustling in the trees, and some of the branches shook and bent and swayed as though somebody was climbing down. And out of those woods and into the white light of the moon stepped the woman who was singing. What a woman! Tall and slim, with long black hair cascading down her back. Her profile was exquisite. She wore a shift, bleached white in the moonlight, with plaid wrapped round her waist and over her shoulder. As she moved out of the trees, I could tell by the way her shift moved that her body matched her profile and her voice for beauty. She stopped and surveyed the battlefield. She threw her head back, baring her exquisite throat, and cackled. The sound, after hearing her singing and seeing her beauty, was truly horrific. It was evil. I noticed she carried a wicker basket and a long, sharp knife that shone in the moonlight. She gracefully stepped over rebel bodies, but fell on the royalist bodies. As I watched, she went through the pockets and bags of the dead men, taking anything valuable she could find. She took rings off fingers, and when she couldn't get the rings off, she hacked the fingers off and put everything, fingers included, into the wicker basket. If the royalist soldier was still alive, she cackled dreadfully and took their life before robbing them. I saw her cut throats, stab them in their eyes, bury the knife in their guts and work it around as the man screamed. I saw her take a musket and beat men's brains out with the butt. She came to one of the injured drummer boys. He was trying to drag himself away off the battlefield, the drum still round his neck, booming and scraping as banging as it was dragged across the ground. She knelt down beside him and gently, like a mother, stroked the boy's forehead. And then she cut his throat and took his meagre money purse. All the time she had a smile on her beautiful face. It was hellish watching her. I was totally unable to reconcile her beautiful singing and beautiful body with what she was now doing so happily. Her shift was covered in blood from her slim waist down to her ankles. Her long white arms and face were splattered in crimson blood. Even her basket leaked blood from the bottom. The battlefield was now totally still and silent apart from this dreadful apparition. I don't know whether I moved or I made a sound. And she suddenly turned to me and I saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were entirely a flaming red with no pupils. Her still lovely body rose and straightened up. She'd seen me. She screamed in a way that made me freeze to my bones and leapt towards me, her knife raised, and I raised my walking stick over my head. I slowly awoke. The sun was rising over a mountain into a lovely blue sky. A warm, soft, fresh breeze blew in my face, and I could smell herbs and flowers in it. There was a flock of sheep grazing happily in the field. I sat for, I suppose, half an hour, remembering what I'd experienced last night. There was no sign of anything today. And before anybody accuses me of anything, that half bottle of whisky is still full. What had happened? I had no idea. But it was a beautiful morning and I was hungry, and I realised I could be back at the hotel for one of their amazing breakfasts. And I walked back the way I'd come. This time I imagined the horrible sight of the royalist soldiers retreating down this path, being stopped by their own baggage train blocking the path and making them scatter into the woods, trying to escape for their lives, being chased by the Jacobites. I stopped briefly by the famous Soldier's Leap. The story goes that one of the English soldiers did escape by jumping across this 18-foot wide ravine through which the river ran with much force. A lot of people doubted that such a leap could ever have been done. However, I knew what he was running from, and I knew that even I could have leapt that gap under those circumstances. I told my wife all about it when we got home. She didn't believe me. She still blamed it on that half bottle of whisky I'd sneaked out that night. But I knew better, because I was drinking that whisky as I wrote this story. Thank you.